This week, we're going to have two separate lecture presentations. This lecture presentation will cover some of the terminology that you'll need to know in order to better understand where we're going next, which is the anatomy of the central nervous system. As always, please have your interactive study guide available so that you can complete it as we proceed through the lecture. It's also a good idea to have the slides available so you can take notes as we go. The brain is a three-dimensional structure, so any location in the brain can be localized on one of three planes. These are the horizontal plane, the sagittal plane, and the coronal plane. The horizontal plane is also known as the transverse plane. It divides the brain into superior and inferior portions. We'll discuss those terms on the next slide, so for now you can think of them as being the upper portion of the brain and the lower portion of the brain. Essentially, the cut would be parallel to the floor. The sagittal plane runs down the midline of the brain. If you were to cut directly down the middle of the brain, you would be left with two separate halves, the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. The coronal plane is also known as the frontal plane. It divides the brain into anterior and posterior portions. We'll discuss those terms on the next slide as well. For now, you can think of the cut just as being parallel to the wall in front of you. Or, if it's easier, you might think of it as perpendicular to the floor. Next, we're going to discuss some anatomical terms that also refer to directions. Those of you who like to pause the recording to watch the videos might pause here to watch the video Anatomical Terms. You'll notice on the right side of the slide there's an image of a man. His palms are facing forward, as are his feet. This is considered standard anatomical positioning, so any questions that are referring to anatomical directions should relate to this positioning of the body. We'll start with dorsal versus ventral. Dorsal means towards the back, or away from the stomach side. Those of you who are familiar with the dorsal fin on a dolphin, for example, can use that as a way to remember that dorsal means towards the back. So while dorsal means towards the back, in the case of the brain or skull in a human, it can refer to up. The reason for that is that most animals are four-legged, so the top of their brain is facing up in the same direction as their backs. Therefore, while dorsal generally means towards the back, in a human brain or skull, it can refer to up as well. It is important to point out that while dorsal generally means towards the top of the brain and ventral towards the bottom of the brain, these terms do not apply for the brainstem and the spinal cord. Instead, when it comes to the brainstem and spinal cord, ventral means towards the stomach side and dorsal means towards the back side. We'll talk more about the brainstem and spinal cord in our next lecture presentation on the anatomy of the central nervous system. So next, we'll move on to anterior versus posterior. Anterior means towards the front end, whereas posterior refers to the rear end. Those of you who have heard a person's bottom referred to as their posterior can use that as a way to remember it. Superior versus inferior. Superior, just as it does if you had a superior score, would mean above. So a superior in terms of anatomical directions means it's above another part. Inferior is its opposite, meaning below another part. We'll learn very briefly about the superior and inferior colliculi as an example of where these terms are used. Lateral versus medial. Lateral means away from the midline, or towards the side of the body. Medial is its opposite. Medial means towards the midline of the body or away from the side. Proximal versus distal. Proximal means it is closer to the point of origin or attachment, compared to distal, meaning more distant from the point of origin or attachment. For example, your shoulder is proximal because it is very close to where the arm attaches. Your fingers are as distal as possible on your arm. Ipsilateral versus contralateral. Ipsilateral means same side of the body. So ipsilateral would refer to your right arm and your right leg. Contralateral means opposite side of the body. Most of the functions of the central nervous system are contralateral in nature. That is, what happens on the right side of the body is generally governed by the left side of the brain and vice versa. The three planes were discussed on the last slide. But to review briefly, the coronal plane shows brain structures as seen from the front. The sagittal plane shows brain structures as seen from the side. And the horizontal plane shows brain structures as seen from above. Let's try this out. Where is your chin located compared to your brain in each of the three planes? In the horizontal plane, your chin is anterior to your brain because it's further forward. In the sagittal plane, your chin is ventral to your brain because it is closer to your stomach side, and also because it is lower than your brain, right? In a human, when we're standing up, the top of the brain is not ventral, but dorsal. Lastly, in the coronal plane, your chin is medial because it is more central to the midline of your body than the brain that spans out laterally from the midline. Now that we've reviewed some anatomical terms that refer to directions in the body, let's review some terms that refer to parts of the nervous system. First, lamina, the plural of which is laminae. You'll notice the plurals are always presented in parentheses on this slide. A lamina is a row or a layer of cell bodies that is separated from other cell bodies by a layer of axons and dendrites. Similarly, a column is also a set of cells, but in this case they're perpendicular to the surface of the cortex, and all of these cells have similar properties. Tract and projection. A tract and a projection are essentially a set of axons within the central nervous system that have cell bodies in one area, whose axons then travel to a different area where they synapse onto a neuron in brain region B, so to speak. So basically, these fibers project from brain structure A to brain structure B. For example, there are 4 different dopamine tracks, which we'll talk about in a later lecture presentation. One of these tracks projects from the substantia nigra to the striatum of the basal ganglia. We would say that tract then projects from cell bodies located in the substantia nigra, whose axons then project to the striatum as a main component of the basal ganglia. Nerves are set of axons in the peripheral nervous system. Either they travel from the central nervous system to a muscle or gland, or from a sensory organ in the periphery to the central nervous system. Nerves are what transmit information to and from the peripheral to the central nervous system. And again, also the other way as well. A nucleus, which plural, nuclei, is a cluster of neuron cell bodies within the central nervous system. The substantia nigra is a nuclei of dopaminergic cell bodies located within the brain. A ganglion, plural ganglia, is a cluster of neuronal cell bodies, but instead of being within the central nervous system like nuclei, they're generally outside of the central nervous system. For example, there are ganglion that are a part of the sympathetic nervous system. These ganglia help transmit autonomic nervous system information throughout the peripheral nervous system. A gyrus, plural gyri, are protuberances on the surface of the brain. You could think of them as being little hills or mountains. They're the areas of the brain that protrude outward. A sulcus or a sulci are these folds or grooves between the gyri, and they're what separate one gyrus from another. You could think of them as being little valleys between the hills. A fissure is essentially a much longer and deeper sulcus. So instead of being a valley, it might be like a Grand Canyon. Lastly, there are white matter and gray matter. White matter is composed mainly of myelinated axons, which is what gives them the whitish color that they have. These myelinated axons carry information from gray matter. Gray matter is composed mainly of cell bodies and dendrites. So essentially, when I was talking about tracks and projections earlier, the dopaminergic cell bodies located in the substantia nigra is primarily gray matter. The projection, that fiber tract, is primarily white matter. Now that we've covered anatomical terms referring to directions and planes of the brain, as well as parts of the nervous system, you're ready to move on to our next lecture presentation, which will cover the topic of the anatomy of the central nervous system.